everyone, I'm going to be doing a video response for week 3, specifically talking about what we've learned from Buyer's Guide and how that impacts campuses and college campuses and what implications we specifically see. We'll look at 3 different ways to understand these impacts. First, we'll look at how the speech codes on campus impact things. Second, we'll look at the impacts to education. And then third, we'll be looking at cyberbullying. But when we start specifically on speech codes, what it is it's a regulation of speech placed by either a college campus or another governing body to tell people what they can and cannot say in a specific form and fashion. Things like this are actually things that, while they're part of free speech, they aren't something that's conducive to an educational environment. We see this 2 ways. First, we see that there's a specific impact to hate speech. Once a college campus regulates the issues going on a campus, specifically with the words that are being used, they have the opportunity to make a greater impact. Hate speech, being things like slurs, are things that are technically protected by free speech as long as they're not inciting violence or something like that, but they're still not something we should allow for. But more than that, we see that having speech codes is actually key to fair opportunities because of an imbalance of power. The way that rhetoric works is that we see that there is a majority and there is a minority. Within the majority, their voices are mainly the ones that are heard. The minority is often crowded out. What we recognize, though, is sometimes when a majority has a problematic perspective, they're actually not only crowding out, but they're also oppressing the minority. What we see is when we establish something like speech codes, it gives us the opportunity to make sure that we're not overshadowing the minority and we're giving them the opportunity to speak. Second, we also see that there are impacts to education when we have speech codes. Again, we have to recognize that speech codes are technically a limitation past free speech, but they actually do 2 things. First, total free speech actually harms education because students are too busy worrying about their peers and what they're saying instead of the educational format as a whole. What we then see is when students are too worried about what their peers are saying, they're negatively impacted because their studies are falling second to them being concerned about things that are being said on their college campus. The impact here is that what we actually recognize at the end of the day is that there is a limitation to an individual's access to education. And when a college campus is focused on equity and access to education, if we have total free speech, it's actually continuing to limit their opportunity to access that. Second, we see that limiting free speech is key to ensuring that an institution can actually function. What we see is that if an institution doesn't have the opportunity to regulate speech for student safety, then they actually fail to be able to do their job. This is specifically because they then can't regulate things like problematic protests because they don't have an avenue in which to cite for the shutdown of this protest. We can take, for example, some of the protests that have happened after the Beto O'Rourke race. What we saw specifically is that individuals who were glad that Ted Cruz won started to begin to look specifically and push out some of the minorities on specific campuses. We saw a lot of this happen on the University of Texas campus. And what we see is that since UT had some restrictions and regulations, they had the opportunity to minimize the impact of these protests. But then, the third way that we can understand that speech codes impact college campuses is specifically on cyberbullying. Now, while cyberbullying is technically something that is regular legal jurisdiction, we see that when we begin to establish speech codes, college campuses get the opportunity to continue to regulate things like cyberbullying, where it's continually rampant across college campuses because currently there's very little regulation. First, we see that without regulation, cyberbullying goes unmonitored. And if we're not monitoring something that has specific impacts to students, then college campuses aren't doing their jobs because they're letting students be susceptible. But second, we specifically see that regulating this digital free speech actually continues to foster discussion. Because when a college campus says that this is a problem that we need to address, people automatically begin to pay attention to the problem and begin to discuss it. What we see is a discussion like this actually allows for people to begin to see why cyberbullying becomes such a problem. Now, when we look at Buyer's Guide to Free Speech overall, we have to recognize 2 things. First, that people don't recognize that speech codes actually do have a net benefit to students, but second, that they actually have a net benefit to the educational sphere as a whole. So when we take a step back and we specifically look at how speech codes and what they are impact a college campus, because we're doing things like minimizing hate speech and we're righting the imbalance of power, we also see that we're impacting education because we're allowing students to focus on their studies instead of what their peers are saying, and also allowing the institution to function and regulate specific situations. And then third, allowing for us to begin to not only regulate but discuss cyberbullying. Overall, what we see is that speech codes do give us an opportunity to regulate free speech further. And while some people think that we shouldn't be able to regulate free speech further, specifically on college campuses, there is a net good that we see. Thanks, y'all.